I want to open this by handing it over to James. We conducted a very scientific poll on Twitter over the last 24 hours, didn't we?
Oh yes, it was highly scientific. It had a red cop alarm emoji around it, so that means that it's a scientific official poll.
I claim full responsibility for the emojis.
So this arose. I'm tempted to create a mini segment called "As I Recently Tweeted." Yes, as I recently tweeted. So I was sort of suggesting that Renaissance was better than Revolution, and some people chimed in with like, "Well, what about Reformation?" And so, well, what about Reformation? So we conducted an official poll to get to the bottom of this pressing issue that Americans care about so deeply. What remedy for our present ills would be most appealing to Americans today, in your view, reader, listener? A, revolution, overturning the existing order. B, reformation, refounding and reshaping institutions. C, renaissance, involving retrieval and rebirth. Or D, recreation, unto death. The postman option.
Can I pick more than one?
Why not both? And the results clearly, dramatically in favor of option C, Renaissance. Not quite an outright majority, but a strong plurality of 48%. Revolution with 13%, Reformation with 27%, and recreation coming in last with a mere 12%.
That's respect, James. That's a respectable 12%.
That's true. Yes, polling is all about just putting disparaging adjectives in front of numbers you don't like.
Exactly. I mean, so far, we should say as of this recording, but we have an hour and 13 minutes left. But by the time you hear it, dear audience, it'll be over with. And the results have stayed pretty much constant, the percentages, since we put it up there.
Despite my efforts to pad the revolution with many sock puppet accounts voting.
Like any good internet poll.
Revolution has almost the same number of votes as recreation, in fact.
Well, someone in the control room needs to just get on the Twitters real quick and just make this more interesting. Come on.
Some twisted souls do consider revolution recreation, so
There we are.
Yeah. So the question that I circle back to is what exactly does reformation mean? The other ones I feel like are fairly straightforward. The 60s did sort of give revolution either too good or too bad of a name, depending on how you want to cut into that. But I'm old enough to remember the days when very intelligent and well-respected analysts said of the Middle East problem that, Islam needs a reformation, a Protestant reformation. That's what we need to bring peace to the Middle East. To which I replied, do you know anything about the Protestant Reformation?
Or, they tried that in the 900s, right? It didn't work out.
No, it didn't
Not
work
so
out.
much.
Can always run again, but
or
100 years of internecine warfare. Well, maybe we're into the Reformation.
Maybe that is right. Black pill. I remember Mitt Romney saying, like, we need to help the Arabs modernize, and I thought, do you know anything about modernization? How's that gone for? Enduring these processes can be very, very violent and bloody, and sometimes revolutionary, but oftentimes as a cycle of revolution and counter-revolution. This is like Tocqueville's big warning to the Europeans is, you should probably learn something from the Americans, because the alternative right now seems to be this endless loop of revolution and counter-revolution as democracy sociologically spreads over the world.
Well, it took France 100 years to get to some sort of stability, right, after their revolution. It wasn't all terror the whole way through the 19th century, but it wasn't peaches and soda either.
Well, and the reports on Macron's reaction to the initial Yellow Vest's response. He barricaded himself in his palace. And
having visions of the
had to wear
Bastille Day.
Had to wear flesh-colored makeup to look like he wasn't a cadaver. Yeah, scary stuff.
I think what's interesting about this, though, is does this represent? This is probably a fairly elite audience, in a weird way. People who are both elite and have time to respond to an American Mind poll on Twitter. But we will poll our subscription list, our subscribers, I think, soon too. If the one thing that strikes me is, I would say, kind of in conjunction with Ryan, well, look, revolution is actually in some sense, is actually necessary, the necessary condition in order to have reformation or renaissance in our situation. And in a way, revolution in the sense we mean it not, not so much violence, but an overturning of an existing order the way we have it here. That's exactly what's going on. I think my take on this would be, I think that people, Epstein is a good example. People are just in the general population, especially on the right, coming to the conclusion that we do live in a kind of corrupt oligarchy, and a lot of the rhetoric they've heard in the past needs to be overturned, and there are severe, deep-rooted problems in America. And that's spreading on the right and the left, right? The DSA kind of has the same message to the left. That's spreading within both parties. And so I would bet over time you will see people actually say this in a lagging way behind what happens politically, because as this old, I think an old order is falling apart in front of our eyes, you will see people be more revolutionary in their rhetoric.
Yeah, we also wanted to talk a bit about Spencer wrote a piece for the American Mind called "Can Conservatism Be Conserved?", which we wanted to raise, and it's I'll let Spencer lay out exactly his argument, but more or less we find ourselves with some strange bedfellows in this new coalition, and we're united against the kind of woke left. Spencer, you want to elaborate just a little bit, and then we can run with it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the difference of opinion reflected in this poll might be related to the phenomenon I'm trying to identify in that piece, which is that, right, I mean, everybody who might feasibly be described as conservative at the moment has almost just one cultural aim, which is increasingly defeating wokeness, that it's just become so high profile and so terrifying what goes on in the name of identity politics and identity sectarianism and so on, that you have more and more people defecting from what they consider the left or the Democratic Party and so on, the intellectual dark web, the Dave Rubin, Blexit, walk away, and all of these things. And all these people may or may not now call themselves conservative. Certainly they are trying to conserve something, namely freedoms of speech and association and so on.
And many of them certainly won't vote for Trump. Didn't vote for Trump and won't vote for him in 2020. But,
no, indeed. And probably won't be considering themselves Republicans anytime soon, even post-Trump phenomenon. And yet they are, I think, identifiably and defensively a coalition of some kind with all sorts of very deep fundamental level disagreements about social issues that just at the moment are not at the fore. And perhaps that's a matter of convenience or practical wisdom, but there it is. And it flares up every now and then in the should we ban porn argument, in even the Amari French debate, in the now infamous Jesse Lee Peterson tweet, "There's no such thing as a gay conservative," which kind of encapsulates, I think, one version of something that a lot of people are thinking, but we're not ready or willing to kick people out of the movement because everybody is so needful and necessary to the movement. And yeah, I think a sort of substantive discussion about what it is actually we do believe together could help us alleviate some of these difficulties. Mm-hmm. Hence the piece.
You only raised these questions. You didn't offer any guidelines for how we navigate this argument going forward.
That's right. In my general...
That's not a criticism I will stand for.
That's essay number 2.
Yeah. That's right. Well, no, it is just part of my general project of maximum chaos at all times, I think.
Well, anyone who follows you on Twitter knows that that's your MO. So.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
Chaotic good, right?
Yes, chaotic.
On brand.
Hopefully.
I do think that's one thing we're endeavoring to do at the American Mind, though, is play host to some of these ideas kind of getting fleshed out. I mean, I can't see AEI putting on a champagne lunch where we sit down and have the conversation, but the American Mind might be, it's not a slam against anybody in particular, you know, but
sure.
But I mean, it's seriously that it is, I guess, what we're trying to do here, which is positive.
That's right. Yeah, and we should invite anybody who's listening to submit pieces trying to come up with some answers to some of these questions. Matt, I think you suggested sort of what is man or what is a human being as kind of the root of a lot of these questions, which I think is a good place to start, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, but before we even get to the deeper questions, I think, we should talk about what's happening. I mean, this is all happening before our eyes. Things are still in flux, and those of us who follow this stuff and fancy ourselves, riding some of these waves and navigating them, sometimes miss the fact that look, the entire two-party system, which will be with us for the foreseeable future, has these moments in which parties and coalitions fall apart and reorganize. So I think a big part of it is to understand what is happening, and the American mind. I mean, I want to know. I want to publish things that help people know the sorts of things that I'm seeking to know. So I want to know, what is this new coalition? Who are these people? What's the contours of it, right? I mean, to what extent is the intellectual dark web a real thing? What does that look like, right? These are things that a lot of people out there have, they might not even know what that is, right? Whereas we think that's an established part of online discourse.
Where am I? How did I get here?
Exactly. So it's very disorientating rhetorically for people. So we want to get a sense of shine a light on what's going on and how are things organizing as it's all in flux, because it's all still moving. Underneath that, there are always serious questions that, in some sense, must unite even prudentially associated coalitions. So if you have a two-party coalition in a country with 330 million people, there's going to be some compromises. It's never going to be perfect, and everyone within the party is going to hate and complain about it because they don't get quite what they want. But nonetheless, you're still going to have movements that are intellectually coherent. And there is not a lot of intellectual coherence in America right now. There really isn't. And so when you ask fundamental questions that our educated classes don't like, by the way, to ask, right? We don't like to talk about virtue, morality. These are old, weird, awkward words. Yep. We don't like to talk about human nature as a thing. We like to talk about social science. We like to talk about technocratic solutions to technocratic problems that we've analyzed as the kind of problems we can solve with material goods. We don't like to go back to that old school philosophy stuff. But ultimately, yeah, that's exactly the kind of debate we're going to have. And I think some very interesting things will happen, I think, as you hint, in that article. But that's a conversation that we almost need to assemble the players together in one place, right? Who are willing to have it. That's what's happening now. We get everyone together who's willing to talk about this stuff, and then we'll start talking about it.
Yeah, you find yourself asking sort of taboo questions very quickly when you open this can of worms, and I think, as you suggest, Matt, and as I think, James, you said, there are a lot of things on what might be called, among conservatives, what might be called conservatives, that kind of amount to like big mood, as the kids say, that people have an intuition, for example, that our sexual mores should be more lax than they were at the beginning of the last century. But nobody can actually answer the question that was kind of laughed off during the sexual revolution, which was, why, if we begin to loosen those mores, will they not simply loosen all the way? And since now there are hints that that's actually happening, the question becomes yet more urgent and yet more taboo to ask. Sort of, what does a quote-unquote socially liberal person have to offer philosophically that stops us from going just all the way in one direction?
Yeah, right. Where's the end?
Right.
Or is it, as the title under different circumstances of our senior fellow Bill Vogeley's first book about liberalism, he asked the question, what's enough?
Right.
And the title he ended up with for his book was Never Enough.
Is there analog to this on the left, out of curiosity? I mean, are people on the left having their own kind of soul-searching conversations? Or is this something that would be kind of novel in its implementation?
Yeah, I mean, I just was looking at Charles Gasparino, Fox Business, has a little scoop reporting that Democrat sources who've spoken with former President Barack Obama say that Obama's getting really anxious about Bernie Sanders now and like where he is in the polls. He's now leading in New Hampshire, and I mean, from one standpoint, if he wasn't leading in New Hampshire, that would suggest that the old Vermonter was not a very good candidate, but that's a story for another day. Anyway, and that now Obama, concerned about where Bernie would take the country, is considering making a public statement of some kind, addressing the situation. Obama's reluctance to endorse his own vice president is just truly epic.
Yeah.
And stuff. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, I mean, I think if Bernie was the nominee, David, then it would be official that both party establishments were dead and gone and not coming back.
That's
and,
it.
And there are folks on the left who, some of them are very enthusiastic about that prospect, and some of them are full on terrified. I think it's got kind of a different valence than what's going on on the right, but it's definitely existential, and it remains to be seen how it's going to shake out.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, on the left, clearly people are questioning intersectionality. That would be the way to put it. They may not be conservative in what they think about sexuality or race or sex or whatever, but they certainly are questioning that the same logic applies to all these things equally. That homosexuality is somehow associated with transgenderism and gender dysphoria, and that's the same as race. And this is so. There's a real questioning, I think, on the dirtbag left, as they call it, which I love, and among various parts of the coalition, to question wokeness and intersectionality. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that people are conservative, but some of them, it's gone so far, as Spencer says, that they're saying, no, I'm on the other side of the fence on this. And there's a lot to sort out there. But I do think that there's a bipartisan questioning of wokeness.
Yeah, I think a couple data points which are interesting, and it shows the old coalition and then the new coalition and divisions within. So the two of the folks who are against the sort of crazy identity politics for slightly different reasons. So Bill Galston, the House liberal at the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, old Clinton advisor, sort of third way, 90s Democrat, really laments the insanity of the left and worries that it's going to lose to Trump because they can't get it under control. And then you have someone like Mark Lilla, who's sort of an old Marxist, reformed, who came out and caused much, gnashing of teeth on the left when he came out against identity politics in an essay. Then he turned it into a book. And his argument is, we got to get back to economics. Galston, I think, talks that way too, but that both of them have very different intellectual journeys in life, but they're both part of this Democrat, certainly, and liberal establishment that is very nervous about I don't know about the prospects of Bernie, but the kind of intersectional madness that you see with multiculturalism, identity politics, and political correctness, and all the rest. So, again, interesting times.
Oh yeah. Oh, I think it applies to Bernie too. I mean, I think he's scaring the crap out of a lot of those guys because they're looking at this going like they're basically in economics. I mean, aren't they kind of part of a little bit of a uniparty establishment? Thinks sort of similarly about economics. With some of them, there's less difference than we make out, right?
Sure, yeah. I think Galston and Lillo, I don't know, would probably agree more with each other than with Bernie, but on economics, but I'm not sure. And remember, Bernie's evolving too. I mean, he's just trying to get intersectional enough. He walked back the old communist line and socialist line, which was to be, of course, pro-worker and anti-immigration.
Which is very sensible.
Bernie's ditched that. He's now pro-open borders, or at least gives lip service to it. And then, he's not quite. I don't think he is identifying his pronouns yet, but he might if he has to.
Well, and it's true that there are some Bernie voters who would absolutely reject the proposition that other Bernie voters would probably die for at this point, which is that lesbians have an ethical obligation, an affirmative ethical duty to date women with penises, right? Like, this is a real fault line. And it's, speaks, Spencer, I think, to like what you're gesturing at in your piece, which I might actually just buckle down and write some kind of response to.
There we go. Just exist to go to you, James.
It's happening. Well, it's like the way in which the politics of sex is playing out is different, profoundly different right now than it used to be. This is not the terrain where it was like late 80s moral majority sort of arguing about public morality and whether laws can and should go in the bedroom one way or the other. And this is more like something like... to what extent is sex now being used as sort of a pathway or an excuse to reduce people to some level of servitude, right? To sort of dis-equip them to participate in like civilized civic life as a sort of an individual who has not been sort of psychologically compromised or dissipated in some way, right? And this is like the new argument about porn. It's not just, oh, people shouldn't do this to each other on video, right? It's like, well, it's not just pornography. It's not just dirty pictures. It's like this pornopticon that is like an infinite universe, right? That anyone can sort of consume infinitely. And what is it? Are we better off sort of viewing that as like some kind of psyop in its effects on people and on society than as sort of like, well, you know, it's people with sort of low morals, like making other people also have low morals, right? It seems to me like the terms of the debate are changing, and even sort of like gay Americans and trans Americans, and, you know, how much do the gays need to respect the trans, and is it okay when, you know, the trans winners of all the medals are sort of like savagely owning like people who were born of the gender of the race of the sex of the competition, and, you know, and this is spreading into education, and the terms of the debate are shifting to, you know, is the project now not fundamentally about sex, but is about this other thing that is using sex to like reshape people psychologically and reshape the culture in a way that makes the fabric of everyday life into something much more totalitarian or, you know, Maoist and performatively self-abasing.
Is it yours or some of the psychosexual compromise?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a phrase that I think captures what we're talking about. And to be clear, I mean, I think it's very traditional. It's actually a better understanding of traditional views of morality than all the kind of Puritanism that talks about, you know, this is bad, this is good. This really gets to what's happening to human nature itself.
This isn't I choose not to get married or I choose to be ethically non-monogamous, but I now realize that psychologically, like my integrity and agency as a person has been sort of disassembled as a result of my experiences, to a degree that I can't get married. I can't raise a family. Like I'm no longer capable of participating in society as that kind of person.
Subverting my ability to live as a full-fledged human being, and therefore making me subservient to some powers that be. Actually,
I don't choose living in the pod. I have to live in the pod. Right. I don't choose, you know, eating the bugs.
Don't eat the bugs. Don't eat the bugs.
No, on the just to bring things back down to just hard politics on the coalitional front on the left. I mean, it's a great irony that the modern progressive left has been sucked into this trans debate, and that of all things, if we were going to be a little glib about it, especially with the Olympics coming up, it turns out that men make the best women.
That's
at least in sports competition. And to say anything against it is, I mean, it all runs in that direction because the natural differences between men and women advantage men who become women rather than the other way around. But I think we've been told by friends of ours who are closer to this that this will be a big inflection point this summer because they're really trying to make it the first trans Olympics in a way. And I think normal Americans and normal people across the West, let alone the East, will be like, what the hell is this?
There is like a real source of frustration here. You know, there are women who are like, oh, so now men are going to sell like cosmetics too? Like now men are going to like, you know, wear full face of makeup too? Now they're going to like, you know, anything that you can do, we can do better, right? There is a sort of feeling like that, and I think you get it from the TERFs, but you get it from, you know, straight women too, to a degree.
Oh, absolutely. There's a Katie Herzog thread out there on Twitter somewhere in which she just says that lesbians are disappearing because of sort of trans faddism, that you find a whole households of lesbians transitioning and then detransitioning, but there's a kind of sense that women are being both devalued and then systematically disappeared by this ideology. I mean, I do think there's a reason why sex is what gets weaponized as the flashpoint for this kind of subjugation, forced disassembling of the person, and so on, and why it's always the most absurd instantiations of that philosophy that end up driving people either away from the left or driving wedges within the left, which is simply the real demand here is to believe an impossible thing, this kind of Orwellian demand that you submit the evidence of your eyes to the implications of an ideology, which you might happily hold in the abstract, but it's not enough. It's not enough to hold in the abstract. You must actually live it out in your own person, at which point you belong to that ideology.
Yeah, and that's where the speech debates come in, right? You can't say man is a man, woman is a woman, or you get banned. I mean, we should explain, though, we use the word TERFs, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. And we have a great article at The American Mind by one of our favorite pseudonymous writers, authors, Peachy Keenan, called TERF Wars, How Radical Lesbians Are Braver Than You Are. And the subheadline says, well, when you watch Fox News, radical left-wing lesbians are fighting your culture war. Yep. So here's an example where you have people within the gay movement who are taking a stand about what nature is, what gender is, what the difference between men and women are, and that is something that, of course, is not getting any media attention, but is actually happening.
And the ground of it is the argument from the TERFs would be, lesbians are women biologically, right. And the trans movement says, yes, you're a bigot. You have to shut up now, or you have to get off your platform. Yeah. Well, we're going over time, so let's just go quickly to our last bit.